In spite of its one-party rule and assault on tradition, Nassau is beginning to gain power.
There was fresh fighting near Gaza, reminding the world of Arab-Israeli tension and the fate of the Palestinians. To avoid new humiliations, Egypt needed modern arms. Where would she find them? Nasser refused to join the British-sponsored Baghdad Pact of Middle Eastern nations, but in April 1955, he attended the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung. There, President Sukarno gave him a starring role. Nehru, at the height of his fame, advised non-alignment. As for weapons, Zhou Enlai advised Nasser to seek Soviet help. The deal was done. The USSR increased its influence in both Cairo and the Middle East. From June 1956, the Soviets supplied the Egyptian army with Czech-made weapons. Nasser also planned to build a dam at Aswan to irrigate, electrify and modernize the nation. The West refused to grant him a loan, so he decided the canal would pay for the dam. On July 26, 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. For Egyptians, the nationalization restored their nation's honor. In London, the British and French proposed that the canal be declared international. Nasser rejected this attempt at international colonialism. On October 29th, Israel attacked. For the Israelis, the nationalization and Egypt's rearmament were too much. 2 days later, the British and the French launched their own attacks, supposedly to stop the Israeli-Egyptian conflict. But their real aims were different. Britain simply wanted the canal back. France, fighting a colonial war in Algeria, wanted to punish Nasser for assisting the Algerian rebels. The Anglo-French explanations to the Security Council were not impressive. Their first attacks came from carriers and air bases in Cyprus and Malta. The Israelis seized the Gaza Strip, further humbling an already humiliated people. Moshe Dayan was in the Sinai. He accepts an Egyptian general's surrender. Israeli soldiers proudly displayed captured Soviet material. On November 5th, British and French paratroops were dropped on Port Said, where the canal meets the Mediterranean. A seaborne invasion followed. While Soviet tanks were finishing off the last of the Hungarian rebels in Budapest, the British and French armies were fighting for Port Said. The Egyptians replied by scuttling ships to block the canal entrance. Ferdinand de Lesseps' statue was blown up. The last drop of French paratroops exasperated the United States and fed Soviet propaganda in the Middle East. By November 2nd, the United States had convinced the UN General Assembly to demand an Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai and a cessation of hostilities. Golda Meir agreed. The British and French had no choice but to agree as well. A UN peacekeeping force arrived to separate Egypt and Israel in the Sinai. The UN troops were acclaimed like liberators. For Egypt, military defeat had become a political victory. The Israelis evacuated. The British and the French soon followed. Their failed gamble would hasten the decline of the colonial empires. Nasser had become the hero of Arab nationalism. And from Port Said and Alexandria, the Europeans were going home. General Qassem was executed in February 1963 after a Ba'athist coup in Baghdad. The new president was Abd el-Salam Aref, but he leaned towards Nasser and soon purged the Ba'athist elements from his regime. In spite of this, the Ba'ath party came to power that March in neighboring Syria. Salah Bitar, the Syrian prime minister, prudently re-entered Nasser's fold. After disturbances and political unrest in June 1963, the Shah of Iran expelled the Ayatollah Khomeini, and he majestically received General de Gaulle in October. With his oil wealth and American support, the Shah wanted Iran to become a strategic focal point from its frontiers on the borders of the Soviet Union and Iraq to the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Khrushchev countered this by cultivating Egypt. Nasser spoke of Soviet imperialism and had the communists arrested, but released them in 1963. In May 1964, he greeted Khrushchev in Alexandria before traveling to the Aswan to open the first stage of the Great Dam. His Soviet guest declared that Egypt was busily building socialism. Khrushchev's last official trip was a resounding success. The waters of the Nile were rerouted. Whole Nubian populations had been displaced, and the ecological effects were unknown. But Egypt was counting on an increase in irrigation and an abundant supply of electricity, and Nasser needed a success to deal with the resurgent Muslim Brotherhood. Would Israel ever know true peace? Many Israelis hoped for détente with the Arabs, but the most extreme Zionists still had not accomplished their goals for a greater Israel. On their doorstep, in Gaza as elsewhere, the interlude gave the Palestinians time to think as well. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was founded. Leaders like Yasser Arafat were sustained by the common revolt against misery. In addition to the conflicting solutions sponsored by the United States and Soviet Union, General de Gaulle offered his own contribution.
La Ve République s'était dégagée vis-à-vis d'Israël des liens spéciaux et très étroits que le régime précédent avait noués avec cet État. Et la Ve République s'était appliquée, au contraire, à favoriser la détente dans le Moyen-Orient. D'autre part, une fois mis un terme à l'affaire algérienne, nous avions repris, avec les peuples arabes d'Orient, la même politique d'amitié et de coopération qui avait été, pendant des siècles, celle de la France dans cette partie du monde. Bien entendu, nous ne laissions pas ignorer aux Arabes que pour nous, l'État d'Israël était un fait accompli et que nous n'admettrions pas qu'il fût détruit.
Nasser made a show of his Soviet weaponry to hide his economic and political difficulties, but constant Arab bickering, Palestinian terrorism, and Israeli raids against Syria exasperated everyone. In May 1967, a parade in Israel commemorated the creation of the state. Nasser asked for the UN troops on the Egyptian side of the border with Israel to be withdrawn. General Secretary U Tant agreed. Israel mobilized. Nasser blockaded the Israeli port of Eilat. King Hussein of Jordan signed a defense pact with Egypt.
Pour éviter les hostilités, la France avait, dès le 24 mai, proposé aux trois autres grandes puissances d'interdire, conjointement avec elle, à chacune des deux parties d'entamer le combat. Le 2 juin, le gouvernement français avait officiellement déclaré qu'éventuellement il donnerait tort à quiconque entamerait le premier l'action des armes.
Israel attacked on June 5, 1967. Moshe Dayan was the new Minister of Defense. Israeli pilots, highly trained, used the element of surprise to annihilate Egyptian aircraft on the ground, then Jordan's, then Syria's. The Arabs lost 418 aircraft, the Israelis only 26. Badly informed by his intelligence services, disconcerted by both his army's deficiencies and his enemy's plan of attack, Nasser was appalled by Israel's popularity in the West.